My rant this morning is over at HartmannReport.com. Is titled, "The News is Too Vital to be Left to the Free Market and Must Again Be Owned and Run by Actual Journalists." I started digging into this yesterday. I've told you the story before about Louise and I back in December of 2003 watching Chris Matthews and Howard Dean on Chris's show, and the conversation they had about breaking up big media. So, you know, it popped into my mind yesterday, and I went off looking, and I actually found the YouTube of the entire show. There's a link to it in my article today. And it's even worse than I remembered. I mean, you know, it's just incredible. This was December 1st, 2003. We were watching Chris Matthews' show. Dean had just been on the cover of Time magazine. He was far and away the leading contender for the Democratic nomination to take on George W. Bush. John Kerry ultimately won that and ran against Bush and lost the election in Ohio. But nonetheless, Chris Matthews says to Howard Dean, "There are so many things that have been deregulated. Is that a wrong trend, and would you reverse it?" Kind of nice general question about deregulation. Dean goes immediately to the media. He says, "I would reverse it in some areas. First of all, 11 companies in this country control 90% of what ordinary people are able to read and watch on their television. That's wrong. We need to have a wide variety of opinions in every community. We don't have that because of Michael Powell and what George Bush has tried to do with the FCC." Matthews looked kind of shocked. And, I mean, here's the leading Democratic presidential candidate saying that he's got a problem with Chris Matthews' employer, right? So he blinks and he says, "Well, as a public policy, would you bring industrial policy to bear and break up these conglomerations of power? How about large media enterprises?" Dean replies, "The answer to that is yes." Keep in mind, this was 2004. "I would say that there is too much penetration," Dean said, "by single corporations and media markets all across this country. We need locally owned radio stations. There are only 2 or 3 radio stations left in the whole state of Vermont where you can get local news anymore. The rest of it's rip and read from the AP." So Chris Matthews, now figuring, okay, I'll give him all the rope he wants, says, "So what are you going to do about it? You're going to be president of the United States. What are you going to do?" And Dean answers directly. He says, "What I'm going to do is appoint people to the FCC who believe democracy depends on getting information from all portions of the political spectrum, not just one." And Matthews kind of goes in for the kill. He says, "Are you going to break up the giant media enterprises in this country?" "Yes," says Howard Dean. "We're going to break up giant media. That doesn't mean we're going to break up all of GE." Now, keep in mind, back then, GE owned MSNBC. "What we're going to say is that media enterprises can't be as big as they are today, to the extent of even having 2 or 3 or 4 outlets in a single community. That kind of information control is not compatible with democracy." And as I told you back in 2004, and this happened on a Wednesday. On Thursday, I went on the air in 2004, and I said, "Let me tell you what I saw last night." And then I said, you know, I turned to Louise and I said, "Howard Dean is toast. This is it. He's gone. The media is going to take him down." They waited 6 weeks, which is, you know, a decent interval, long enough for people to forget that conversation with Chris Matthews. And then Howard Dean was given a speech at the Valair Ballroom in West Des Moines, Iowa, a state that he was heavily favored to win. And he ended it by saying, you know, "We're going to New Hampshire, Thom Hartmann. We're going to South Carolina and Oklahoma and Arizona, North Dakota, New Mexico, California, Texas, New York. Yeah." And at that point, you know, the crowd was yelling and applauding so wildly that Dean, to be heard over them, had raised his voice and put this unidirectional microphone. These are microphones that only hear what's within 3 or 4 inches of the end of the microphone. It's the kind that professional performers use, so you don't get any feedback, right? He pushed that right up against his mouth. His entire riff sounded perfectly normal to people in the room and to the reporters in the room. But in the control rooms back in New York, it was clear that his voice had gone up a half octave and his "yeah" sounded like a scream. And it just took him a minute to clip that out and push it out. And over the next 4 days, the so-called Dean's Scream, a complete fabrication of these giant corporate media outlets, just over the next 4 days, it was replayed 633 times. Yep, sure enough. The country's leading liberal had gone flat out bonkers mad. And that was the end of Dean's presidency, or candidacy. Now contrast that with how Donald Trump got coverage. I mean, he was a star of The Apprentice. NBC had paid him millions. They had a good, tight relationship. He was making so much money for the networks that Les Moonves, when he was running for president and during the primary, Les Moonves, the head of ABC News, said, "I've never seen anything like this, and this is going to be a very good year for us. Sorry, it's a terrible thing to say, but bring it on, Donald. It may not be good for America, but it's damn good for CBS." And then Emily Stewart over at The Street writes, the real estate magnate got $4.96 billion, this is Trump, in free earned media in a year leading up to the presidential election, according to a firm from tracking Media Quant. He received $5.56 billion in free media throughout the entirety of his campaign, more than Hillary Clinton, Bernie Sanders, Ted Cruz, Paul Ryan, and Marco Rubio combined. And there you are. This is what happens when your media is owned by a small handful. As Howard Dean pointed out, it was 11 companies back then. A small handful of companies who, clearly have basically a political agenda. And I think we saw the same thing in this election in Virginia, frankly, was that was there any coverage of Glenn Youngkin being the former CEO of Carlyle Group, or even what Carlyle Group was? Was there any coverage of the fact that Glenn Youngkin said that he doesn't believe climate change is man-made? Was there any? I mean, it's like just the whole coverage thing is like just totally weird. We have lost news. Instead, we have news stars who will spend the first 5 minutes setting up one particular topic, and then they'll bring on, 2 or 3 guests. There's an old axiom, by the way, in television news. The weaker the host, the more the number of guests, right? So they'll bring on 2, 3, 4 guests, and let's have a long and detailed discussion about this from talking heads who are mostly former Republicans. Right. CNN is owned by AT&T. That's the company that funded the creation of One America News, the Trumpy TV network. MSNBC and NBC are owned by Comcast, probably the leading opponent of net neutrality in the United States and the antitrust laws. ABC, is owned by Disney. CBS is owned by Viacom, which also owns Paramount Pictures. Every one of those companies has an agenda that is not news. So what I'm saying, and that's why, you haven't heard a single word about the PRO Act, the Right to Unionize PRO Act. Well, the big media giants don't like that. Have you heard an honest discussion on the media about the Medicare Advantage scam? No, they're making millions off it. Or Big Pharma ripping off Americans? Nope. How about the actual famine that's now going on in Afghanistan? No, not a thing, but you're hearing all about critical race theory. Excuse me, even though there is no critical race theory being taught in American schools. You're hearing all about this tiny slice of, we're not going to get vaccinated. New York, it was supposed to be 10,000 cops won't get vaccinated. What was the final number, 38? And of course, brown people at the border, oh my God. We are stuck in a media cycle of dopamine addiction. Everything in the news these days is like speed or sugar. It gives a temporary high and jolts the attention mechanism of the brain, but provides no nourishment. We need to re-regulate the media. We need to undo the Telecommunications Act of '96, go back to local ownership rules, break up the giant media monopolies, and go back to the fairness doctrine requirement that actual news be run at the top of the hour on radio stations, actual news, and be run for a full hour every night on network news. Actual news. If we don't, I'm very, very concerned about the future of our democracy. We are looking at this corporate media being played like a fiddle by the hard right, and in many cases owned by the hard right.